afternoon, everyone. My name is Adrienne Luckenbacher, and I'm the moderator for today's presentation, Understanding Adverse Childhood Experiences. I want to welcome everyone again who have joined us or that are new to the Opioid and Other Drug Virtual Series provided by the St. Clair County Community Mental Health in partnership with the Community Services Coordinating Body. This web series is made possible by a grant awarded by SAMHSA, the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration. We're very excited to continue to broadcast this virtual series through the month of September, which is National Recovery Month. As always, going into the virtual series today or the virtual presentation, I'd like to share some housekeeping tips and some general information. Today's session is being recorded. We also want to encourage everyone to use their chat button at the bottom of their screen. This is for the ability to answer questions, share resources, anything that you feel would be beneficial to share with today's presentation. If time allows, we're going to do our best for the presenters today to answer questions. So go ahead and submit your questions, and if we have time, we will certainly get to the questions for the presenters. Continuing education today is available. If you had pre-registered through our sccmh.org, continuing education credits are offered today for individuals. And just as a note, continuing education credits are not available to those who watch on Facebook Live or watch this series after it's been recorded. Please make sure when you signed into the virtual series that you use your first name and last name full first and full last name. If you weren't able to do that, you can exit out and re-enter the Zoom, again, putting your full first and your full last name, please. You must be logged on for continuing education credits for the entire duration of the series or the presentation today. If you find yourself getting booted out or losing connection, go ahead and log back in because we're able to keep track of it on our end to make sure that you were able to attend the entirety. Continuing education credits will be only given to those who complete a very short quiz and a survey after the webinar. These materials were included in your email with your link. And if you also need them or can't find them, you can go to our sccmh.org page where you registered, and you can click under the presenter for the day. Their PowerPoint, biography, the survey, the quiz are all there at your fingertips so that you're able to get those resources. This series, like all the others, have in and out codes, and the in code for today is health, H-E-A-L-T-H, health. And that's going to be in all caps. Again, the in code for today's presentation is health. So now we're going to go ahead and move to our presentation. Today, we would like to welcome Dr. Annette Mercatante and Alyson Koch. Dr. Mercatante is the Medical Health Officer of the St. Clair County Health Department and has been since 2009. A Detroit native, she is an alumni of Michigan State University and Wayne State University School of Medicine. She completed her family practice residency at St. John's Hospital out of Detroit and then worked as a private physician from 1990 until 2008. She received her master's in public health from the University of Massachusetts Amherst in 2011. The health department's mission is to promote and protect health through assessment, planning, and response so that the public can achieve optimal well-being. Our second presenter today is Alyson Koch. She's a graduate of Central Michigan University with a bachelor's degree in community health education, as well as a certified health education specialist. She's been educating adolescents for the past 5 years in social, emotional health, and substance abuse prevention programs. With that, I would like to turn it over to our presenters today.
And the reason we entitled it The Transformation of Health, because ACEs has, as you will see, has a profound impact on almost every factor of our well-being. So let's get to it. What happens? What if the largest public health discovery of our time is really about the smallest of us? It's about the smallest part of our bodies as we begin our journey through life. From that first spark of life, cells divide and form a tiny beating heart, a fragile skeleton, and a central nervous system. The experience of being in a relationship with another person and with the world around us has a profound impact on who we are and who we will become. And although we can recall and describe with words much of what's happened in our lives, The memory of a human experience is actually stored in our bodies, not just our minds. So I'm going to share with you the findings from the Adverse Childhood Experience Study. We call it the ACEs study, the ACE study. The ACE study confirms with scientific evidence that adversity early in life increases physical, mental, and behavioral problems later in life. The ACE study is the largest study of its kind with over 17,000 participants, and it was developed and co-sponsored by Kaiser Permanente, a managed care consortium of San Diego, California, and the CDC, the Center for Disease Control and Prevention in Atlanta, Georgia. This was done in the early 90s. And Dr. Vincent Folletti, the pictures here, and Dr. Rob Anda are the co-principal investigators of the ACEs study. Dr. Anda on the left, who designed the ACE study while he was working as a senior scientist at CDC, has reviewed and approved the information that I'll report to you today. I do want to mention that I'm going to back up and actually provide the biological studies that have actually occurred after the ACE studies was published. Allie's going to go over the epidemiological study of ACEs. So we're going to flip this, but I think the biology explains a lot of the foundation of what we're starting to see. So brain development, the human central nervous system connects us to ourselves, to other people, and into the whole world around us. The central nervous system consists of the brain, the spinal cord, and it integrates all of our senses and information from the receptors located throughout the human body inward. So it regulates internal body functions and also manages the elaborate chemicals and electrical signals that we respond to our lives. The nervous system considers every sensory input in the context of each and every second, almost instantaneously. And it determines our understanding of and response to the world we live in. Cells in the central nervous system are called neurons, and they're stunningly effective at processing and transmitting information, and they have a central purpose in doing so. The purpose of the human nervous system is to keep us alive. And that's very important as we go through this. The changes that happen are all for our survival intrinsically. So Dr. Martin Teicher of Harvard University is the chief investigator behind much of what I'm going to present. And he has also reviewed and approved all of the brain science that's in this presentation. So on the far left, we see a set of brain cells or neurons and what they might look like at the time of birth. Obviously, this is an illustration, but it simplifies it. There aren't many connections actually at birth between these cells, the neuron cells, at birth. Babies are born with only the connections and brain functions that they need at that point in their life. So most of our wiring of our brain occurs as the result of life experiences from our senses. Sensations come in, they stimulate the nerves, and as a result, they grow and they connect. And by age 6, those same brain cells now have many connections, and that's illustrated in that middle panel. The wiring of the brain, or the making of complex neural networks, is experience dependent. So what gets experienced the most tends to lead to more robust connections between the nerve cells that form these networks. And this is a process called branching or arborization. The last section of the slide represents age 14, about the time of puberty. Notice that there are now fewer connections between the brain cells than there were at age 6. And this is because the least experienced connections tend to withdraw at about the time of puberty. And this process is called pruning. This phenomenon helps explain why neglect or not getting the experiences we need, not getting the experiences we need can have such a powerful negative impact on our health and social functioning. So every person's life is unique. It can take different trajectories. But for illustration, let's imagine two worlds. One is mean and dangerous along the top, and the second is kind and generous along the bottom. Traumatic experiences during development, like abuse, neglect, and chaotic relationships, generates predictable patterns of brain architecture, and as well as our behaviors and traits. Humans are only really made to be under stress for about 20 minutes at a time, long enough to prepare for a fight or hide, fight or flight. So experiences that cause stress chemicals to be continuously produced, for example, in child abuse, neglect, or even being in a war zone, this has a big impact on development. Under these circumstances, our bodies tend to prepare for life in a dangerous world. It changes things. So stress hormones exert influence on cells, on chemicals, and on our wiring. They sculpt the brain that are wired for certain characteristics, like being edgy, hot-tempered, impulsive, hypervigilant, or being withdrawn, dissociated, or numb. This is the path outlined on the top line of the slide. For example, people who have traumatic stress from conception to the toddler years will likely have a higher baseline of the stress hormones like cortisol in their bodies. And as a result, these folks may have a very short fuse. They may be self-focused and may have difficult time shifting gears from emotional to problem solving. If there's more danger just around the corner, being focused on others and thinking through options isn't really the best way for survival. Readiness for the next danger is how our brains develop. The downside is that when stress hormones like cortisol hang around for a long time, they're toxic to the brain and to the brain cells. This toxicity includes making it difficult for brain cells to develop healthy neural networks and can even cause brain cells to die. That's why we call continuous stress, trauma, and episodic unpredictable stress toxic stress. Dr. Teicher calls the lower path in this diagram the benevolent world path. This world is kind, easygoing, helpful, and free from trauma, and free from traumatic stress. People growing up on this pathway tend to develop their brains more focused, flexible, and relation-oriented. Their wiring develops differently. So let's consider what kind of a situation might be a good match for a person who tends to be edgy, hypervigilant, emotionally detached, or quick to act. In certain situations and careers, this may be of a benefit. One common belief in our society is that people whose experience takes them on the top path of that are maladaptive, and the people along the bottom path are adaptive. But that's not true. Both pathways are adaptive. Both brains are adapting to their experiences in the best way to survive. And so that's good for us as a species. People whose brains adapt to a dangerous or stressful world are more likely to survive when life is tough. And the people whose brains adapt to a safe world are likely to be prepared to meet society's expectations in tranquil times. Our experiences get wired into our biology, and they allow us to survive. So Dr. Teicher says it's when our biology collides with social expectations that we run into trouble. If you put a person from the benevolent world into the chaotic and turbulent environment of, say, riot control, that person may struggle unless they've learned some very specific skills. And we know how to train people to do a better job in this environment. Likewise, a child adapted to a dangerous, stressful world may not sustain the patience that they need, or he or she may not share, cooperate, or use words as a first choice. When that child comes to school and we ask him or her to sit still and to share and to cooperate, there can be a painful disconnect that's hard for everyone. That child will have to be actively taught the skills required to succeed in this context, just as we would train a person from the benevolent pathway how to act in a chaotic or dangerous environment. With this team at Harvard and McLean Hospital, Dr. Teicher learns about the human brain and biology through systematic process, isolating one factor at a time. What he does is he compares the brains of people who have experienced neglect or abuse to brains of people who have not. His findings suggest that maltreatment affects brain development in very predictable ways. Not all experiences generate the same effects. There appears to be at least 3 known variables that determine the effects of maltreatment: the type of maltreatment, the gender of the individual, and the age at the time of maltreatment. So we're going to go through some of these and give you some examples of what we found. So let's take a closer look at one of the factors that determines the effects of maltreatment: age. And you might ask, why would the age of a person at the time of maltreatment have such a powerful effect? That's because the brain develops in a sequence from most primitive to most advanced. Now think about it. A tiny baby doesn't need to be able to write a paper or pass a math test. He does need to breathe, eat, regulate her body temperature, sleep, and connect with someone who will nurture and protect her. So the parts of the brain that control these functions, the ability to eat and the ability to connect, etc., they develop earliest. Brain regions that control complex thought processes like abstract writing and math, they're not fully developed until much later in childhood. And so continues this magnificent dance of experience and adaptation that generates these age-appropriate capacities for feeling, thinking, and responding to the world around us and surviving. So as the brain develops, there are sensitive periods for each brain region when the size and functional abilities of that region are most affected by the experiences and are most vulnerable to this toxic stress that I described. Now, new abilities build on the growth and development from earlier months and years, like a scaffolding. Build the first part and then you add to it. So over time, elaborate systems of very specialized brain regions develop that help us to navigate increasingly complex environments, but they're built over the more basic structures that are laid in place earlier in life. So one of these elaborate systems is the limbic system. This is the brain region. The brain regions in the limbic system control many things, including physical balance, internal temperature regulation, and digestion. So the functions we're going to focus on are the system's ability to regulate hormones, mood, heartbeat, and behavior. The limbic system is vital for learning, memory, and reward reinforcement processes that help us stay on a healthy track. So the limbic system has a very important role in the fight or flight response to danger. So the hippocampus and the amygdala are 2 regions in the limbic system that are vital for forming healthy relationships. They're centers for affect or mood and attention. They help us make meaning from social cues and language and help us to remember verbal and spatial information. So these regions regulate panic, fear, and a whole range of emotional responses. They help us put the brakes on emotional outbursts when we need to. The hippocampus and amygdala are vulnerable to all forms of maltreatment, particularly in the first 3 years of life, and to sexual abuse through the age of 5. But the effects of this maltreatment may not be seen for another 9 to 13 years. And that's because at birth, the hippocampus has a granules or seedling cells, they're called, that are biologically programmed to grow and mature around puberty and adolescence. If you will, they're turned on at adolescence. They're dormant at the time that these experiences are occurring. And delayed symptoms from toxic stress actually can occur because stress hormones like cortisol kill these seedling cells. So when these cells are killed off, again, in this early part of life, the first 3 years of life, the effect can't often be seen until years later when they fail to grow and produce the brain mass needed for specialized functioning. Pretty impressive. So another brain region with seedling cells is the cerebellar vermis, which connects the 2 halves of the cerebellum, the back part of our brains. The vermis helps us to move through our physical environment enables us to perceive peripheral detail and the world around us. So it's the part of our brain that pays attention to what's going on with a group of strangers standing on the side of the road, even though we're continuing to walk towards our destination. It's no surprise that one consequence of maltreatment is attention problems, including attention deficit disorder and attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. The vermis is also the part of the brain that regulates the release of our feel-good brain chemistry, such as norepinephrine and dopamine. Research on abuse in this region shows not only reduced size of the vermis with abuse, but decreased blood flow as well and decreased functionality. With limited access to positive feelings, it isn't surprising that impacts to this region can lead to vulnerability for depression and substance abuse. So the vermis is sensitive to all forms of maltreatment, primarily just before puberty, and symptoms, again, may not be fully emerged until early adulthood. The vermis may be the seat of mental health. It has a role in virtually every mental illness, including schizophrenia, borderline personality disorders, and depression. We're only beginning to understand the biological connections between trauma-induced adaptations in the vermis and the serious and persistent mental illnesses. So some brain regions have several periods of sensitivity that span throughout childhood. And the corpus callosum is one of these. It's the superhighway that connects the right and the left hemispheres of our brain. So each hemisphere of our brain is specialized to control the movement and feelings in the opposite half of the body. And each hemisphere specializes in processing certain types of information, such as language or spatial patterns. So in order to coordinate movement or think about complex information, the right and the left hemisphere of our brains must communicate with each other. And that's what the corpus callosum does. It helps us interpret and apply symbols and to integrate language and mathematics. And it's the part of our brain that we use when we're given story problems in school, where we have to use multiple areas of our brain. So, exposure to neglect in infancy, especially in boys, and exposure to sexual abuse around ages 9 and 10, especially in girls, seem to have a powerful impact on the corpus callosum. Exposure impedes cell division and interrupts the myelination of the nerve fibers, which is the fatty layer of insulation that helps nerve cells communicate. Without myelination, the nerve signals don't go through. So maltreatment also disrupts electrical activity, making cross-brain communication less reliable. Less cross-brain communication can lead to the inability to integrate rational ideas, especially when in a highly emotional state. So we may know someone who doesn't seem to be able to respond when you ask him or her to calm down so you can talk through a problem, right? This may not be a choice. This may be a biological adaptation to a childhood experience. Toxic stress in early childhood has profound impacts on brain structures and functions that develop later in childhood. These functions include mediation of emotional responses, social interactions, and abstract thinking. That's why people say that early childhood is so important, and they're right. But early childhood isn't the only sensitive developmental period in the brain, according to this latest research. Brain research that's been introduced is accurate, although very early in its limitations and scope. But each brain region seems to have a sensitive period when experiences have powerful effects on brain mass and functioning. For example, during middle childhood, around ages 7 to 13, emotional and verbal abuses can affect the centers for processing sound, developing verbal language, and perceiving social cues. Effects can be different for boys and girls. For example, both neglect and sexual abuse affect boys and girls. But neglect in infancy and through the toddler years for boys has a larger effect on cross-brain communication, while the cross-brain communication is profoundly affected in girls through sexual abuse around the age of 7 or 10. So by the time we reach our mid to late 20s, our central nervous system with the brain and its command center orchestrates everything from our anatomic bodily functions like breathing to complex goal-oriented behavior and abstract thinking. The elaborate signaling system in our brains is well practiced. In a fraction of a second, it determines whether a sensory information from sight, sound, taste, smell, whether it should come into the brain and be processed, or whether the information must be filtered out in favor of survival. So stress may be interpreted by the brain as something we can tolerate and work through, or something that's overwhelming. But the point is, our set points for that interpretation are largely in place by early adulthood. Let's talk about one more thing before we get to the actual ACEs study, and that's called epigenetics. Epigenetics is an exciting new scientific field that explains how experiences get under our skin. It's about our genes that contain the DNA of our cells. They provide the instructions for our cells to become specialized into liver, heart cells, and everything else. And also they contain keys to disease and well-being throughout our life course. So epigenetics tells us about the ways that the instructions of our genes are used, the way they're read and processed. So to understand epigenetics, it's important to understand a bit about how DNA is organized. For example, think of a long strand of fishing line, many yards of it. And in order to fish without the line getting tangled or disorganized, the fisherman puts the line on a reel so that the line can be let out or brought back in, stay organized. So we have thousands of genes, and our long strands of DNA are tightly condensed into the chromosomes in the nucleus of our cells. Looking more closely, like the fishing line on a reel, our DNA is actually wrapped around protein balls called histones. Epigenetics involves the attachment of chemicals, represented by the orange cylinders in this diagram, to the DNA at a particular gene. And the attachment of that chemical, it's called methylation, can prevent the gene's message from being available to be read. And other types of chemical attachments can cause the gene to be opened up so the instructions can be read and used. So it turns genes on and off. Here's where there's relevance to ACEs. New research suggests that stressful experiences can influence these chemical attachments. And that influences the reading of our genetic code in ways that can have a negative effect on the way our cells function. This may be an important reason why ACEs are related to so many health and social problems. The hopeful part of this is that other types of positive life experiences may also affect the reading of our genes, and it may actually reverse the negative effect of ACEs and have positive effects on our human development. So it's good and bad. So epigenetics is a new science, and it tells us that the ability of our cells to read the message on our genes is influenced by our experiences. But they're also discovering that the responses to stress could be passed on from generation to the next. In one study, scientists conditioned rats to be afraid of the smell of cherry blossoms. And when the cherry blossom odor came into the rat's environment, they huddled together, stunned and scared with fear until the odor was removed. So these rats had pups who were removed from that cage. They grew up without any exposure to cherry blossom odors. And this generation of rats were separated from their parents and placed in a completely different environment. So they weren't taught anything from their parents. But when the smell of cherry blossoms was put into their environment, the rats were jumpy and fearful. They had a heightened sensitivity to the smell of cherry blossoms. I think we can all relate to this many aspects of nature. So why might this be a good thing for sensitivity or fear to be passed on from one generation to another through epigenetics? Why might it be a good thing for rats to feel fear even though no one instructed them to fear cherry blossoms? Well, we go back to survival. Fear can protect a species from dangerous situations or toxins. And it may be adaptive for fear to be passed on from one generation to the next, if it can prevent poisoning or avoid dangers. So the field of epigenetics may help us understand how groups of people may be deeply affected by historical trauma, despite current efforts to care for each other better. But how do we heal the wounds of our ancestors? We may not fully know the answer to that question, but we do know that we're the ones responsible today because we are starting to understand the truth through this important work. So let's think again about positive side of experiences being passed from one generation to another. It's just not all about the bad stuff. Scientists are testing whether positive characteristics like nurturing behavior can actually be inherited from one parent to another, from grandparents. The field of epigenetics provides us with this kind of hope and a way of relating to one another that can create lasting positive changes as well in the aspect of genetic expression. So with that, I am going to let Allie talk to you about the ACEs study.
All right. We talked about the effects of toxic stress on individuals, but now we're going to switch gears and talk about the effects of toxic stress on the population as a whole. And so we're going to turn to epidemiology. Epidemiologists are scientists who study the origins of diseases, disability, and productivity and health of populations. And they really help us focus in our efforts on issues and processes that will make the most difference for the well-being of everyone. So we're going to talk about a large epidemiological study about the enduring effects of ACEs, or adverse childhood experiences. Dr. Rob Anda and Dr. Vincent Folletti are the co-principal investigators of the study, which we call the ACE study. So during the latter part of the 20th century, we have learned a whole bunch about risk factors that could be major causes for diseases, disabilities, and premature death. Things from as simple as hand washing to cancer screenings to public health campaigns became a lot more prominent, and national education programs really raised awareness about many health issues due to cigarette smoking. And massive campaign was launched also to teach the public about HIV transmissions. And although public health campaigns are really, really effective, they just don't work for everyone. So we'll talk about cigarettes, for example. Despite the massive knowledge of the health risks, many smokers never quit, while some do try but fail. So why are they unable to break this habit, and why did they start in the first place? So during the late 1980s, Dr. Robert Anda was an internist and epidemiologist working at the CDC in Atlanta. Him and his colleagues showed that people who were depressed were much more likely to smoke. And when they were followed up 10 years later, those who were depressed were less likely to quit. So why? At that time, people were really talking about self-medication, and that was a kind of a way to understand behaviors like smoking or excessive drinking or drug use. And the concept is that the use of psychoactive drugs are more common in people who struggle with depression and anxiety. And in the case of depression, and it's linked to smoking, it became apparent that the nicotine in the tobacco was the likely explanation, because nicotine can reduce symptoms of depression and anxiety. So the benefits in that nicotine was helpful in reducing these unpleasant emotions, kind of helped explain the knowledge of the health risks due to smoking. They just weren't enough for some of these people to quit. So shortly after publishing these studies, Dr. Anda met Dr. Vincent Folletti, and he is the director of the Department of Preventative Medicine at the Kaiser Permanente in San Diego. He was visiting CDC to show his findings that related sexual childhood abuse to morbid obesity in women. And he believed that obesity was an understandable response of this form of childhood trauma because of the potential soothing effects of eating, but also morbid obesity could be a deterrent against unwanted sexual advances. So something clicked between the two doctors. Could it be that childhood adversity is the origin for later risk factors for major diseases and disabilities? So they reviewed literature on the effects of childhood abuse and realized it was really time to broaden the scientific scope to include more public health perspectives on the effects of childhood abuse and related adverse experiences. So scientific research begins with a hypothesis, and that's an educated guess about what will be found in that study. And when the doctors developed their hypothesis, the leading edge thinking at that time was just the top 3 layers of the pyramid you see here. How health and risk factors lead to disease, disability, and early death. But the doctors also knew that something was missing. And they could see this because health risks aren't random. They are concentrated in some populations and not others. And people who have one risk generally tend to have others, so they cluster. So they decided their hypothesis that multiple forms of childhood adversity could be a major determinant of health. So the ACE study hypothesis is that ACEs disrupt neurodevelopment, which in turn leads to social, emotional, and cognitive adaptations that can then lead to the risk factors from major diseases, disability, social problems, and then early death. So since the time of the ACE study, major breakthrough research in developmental neuroscience and epigenetics, which Dr. Mercatante talked about, show us that the hypothesis of the ACE study is biologically sound. Neuroscience and epigenetic discoveries really help us understand the progression of adversity from preconception all the way through life course. And historical trauma and generational adversity increases the risk for ACEs, which in turn then generates risk for disease, disability, and social problems. So the ACE pyramid is really just a life course model from preconception to death, and it's designed to help us understand how ACEs influence human development in predictable ways. And that's really important because what is predictable is preventable. So most prior studies really focused on a single type of adversity, such as sexual childhood abuse. And the ACE study really broadened the picture to include multiple types of childhood stressors. In addition, the survey measured a wide array of health and social problems as well. So this is how the ACE study expanded knowledge into broader public health perspective. And the ACE study is unique because it provides a potential to understand how multiple forms of childhood stressors can affect the many important health problems. So the design of the ACE study began in 1991. And in 1994, the CDC provided funding to conduct the ACE study at the Department of Preventative Medicine in San Diego. More than 17,000 adult members of the Kaiser Health Insurance Plan completed a survey about experiences like childhood ACEs, health behaviors, disease risks, mental health, behavioral problems, substance abuse, and their ages range from 19 to 94 years old. And these participants were generally well educated. Most had attended college, and only 6% did not have a high school diploma compared to 13% of the US population. They were also predominantly white middle-class people who had access to some of the best healthcare in the world. And they're still being studied or followed today to assess the relationship of ACEs to cause death, incidence of disease, and healthcare utilization. So it's just really important that we broaden the scope that ACEs can happen to anybody. So this slide shows us the 10 categories of the ACEs that were studied. And the first group indicates household dysfunctions. So that includes growing up with a substance abusing household, 27%, parental separation or divorce, 23%, mentally ill household members, or witnessing intimate partner violence, specifically having a mother beaten, and then also criminal behavior. So that shows a percentage of the participants who dealt with household dysfunction. There were 3 forms of childhood abuse studied, and that was emotional, physical, and sexual. And then 2 forms of neglect were included, which was emotional and physical. So as you can see, ACEs are very common in the middle class, as well as the highly educated population, something we generally don't think too much about. And they're also really highly interrelated. So generally where one ACE occurs in a child, 87% of the times, another ACE is going to occur. And the fact that 10 different categories of ACEs tend to cluster called for a new way of looking at how ACEs might affect the health and social well-being. And we're going to learn a little bit more about this in the next slides. So like I said, ACEs don't generally occur in isolation. And for example, the emotional, physical, and sexual abuse are highly related to being exposed to intimate partner violence. In the first cluster of bars on the left, the height of the bars is a percentage of people who had experienced emotional abuse. And the frequency for witnessing partner violence increases from never to once or twice to very often. The risk of emotional abuse increases dramatically. And the same pattern is seen for the physical abuse in the middle and sexual abuse on the right. This means that where there's domestic violence, specifically violence against mothers, the risk for childhood abuse increases dramatically. And because the ACEs are so highly interrelated, it really didn't make sense to look at them in single categories of how they influence health and social problems. So the doctors developed an ACE score. And the score is just a count of how many categories of ACEs that somebody experienced from 0 to 10. So each category counts as 1. So if a person experienced physical abuse, no matter how many times, they would have an ACE score of 1. Or if that person had a physical abuse, but also a substance abuse using family, they would have an ACE score of 2, and so on. So it's important to think of ACE score as a measure of childhood of a biological stress dose. As the ACE score goes up, on average, the exposure to the developmental effects of toxic stress increases as well. And in this illustration, you can see that only a third of people had 0 ACEs, but 16% had 4 or more. And so they're very common, and they do tend to cluster, and they are very truly are a hidden burden on our population and society. And people who do report higher ACE scores are more likely to have health and social problems. And as the ACE score goes up, the percentage of people with health go up as well. And we call this a dose-response relationship. So just think of it as putting gas in your car. The more gas you put in your car, the further your car can drive. So in this case, where there are higher doses of ACEs, you're going to have higher percent of people with health risks and health problems. All of the data slides from the ACE study are generally going to look the same. And so the bottom horizontal axis are the ACE scores from 0 to on the left to 4 or more on the right. And the vertical axis is the percent of people with the disease or condition. So in this first set of bars on the far left, we're going to look at the percent of people who had early onset smoking by age 12. And that number goes up as each level of ACE scores goes up. And on the second set of bars, the percent who were smokers of adults also goes up in stepwise fashion as the ACE goes from 0 to 4. And people with higher ACE scores definitely then have an increased risk of COPD. And about 4% of people with an ACE score of 0 had COPD, but 9% of people with an ACE score of 4 or more reported COPD. So ACEs really can lead to an early onset of smoking, which is then sustained through adulthood, which eventually will lead to a higher risk of acquiring a smoking-related lung disease. And since ACEs are traumatic, we know they can result in depression and anxiety. And nicotine actually can reduce symptoms of depression and anxiety. So the benefit of that, of reducing those unpleasant feelings, can help explain why, even though there's a high knowledge of the risk of smoking, it's just sometimes not enough for people to quit. So why would a 12-year-old be more likely to smoke if they had high ACE scores? The effect of ACEs on the developing brain leads to a higher likelihood of depression, anxiety, or having a difficulty of concentration. And it turns out that nicotine can reduce those feelings and can improve concentration. So it's really no wonder a 12-year-old or kids with high ACE scores would be more likely to smoke. For them, it's self-medication. It helps them feel better. Similarly, injecting IV drugs can be a way to cope with feelings or circumstances that make us feel bad. And there are definitely high consequences of health problems with those as well. So the concept of adaptive behaviors, even with known health consequences in the face of ACEs, leads us to believe, or leads us to the idea of trauma-informed care. And that changes the idea of saying what's wrong with you to saying what happened to you. And this way of asking people about problems really reduces shame and blame and leads to a more compassionate, helpful interaction. So now we can begin to anticipate why ACEs are related to certain behaviors and social outcomes. And we see the risk of becoming an alcoholic increases 6-fold from an ACE score of 0 to an ACE score of 6. And ACEs also affect relationships. So people with higher ACE scores are more likely to marry alcoholics. And so it's no wonder ACEs can be generational, passed down from generation to generation. The risk of liver disease also goes up with ACEs due to the behaviors with that. Risk factors for liver disease include injecting drugs, contaminated needles, or having intercourse with a person infected with the virus, or consuming large quantities of alcohol. And we know depression is the leading cause of disability in developed countries, and the risk of depression increases dramatically for both men and women in the dose response fashion as the ACE score goes up. So ACEs are held in the body. They lead to mental, physical, and behavioral health problems in adulthood. And some problems are unintentionally handed down to the next generation. Becoming an alcoholic, marrying an alcoholic, suffering from depression are part of the intergenerational transmission of ACEs. So we've looked at how the chances of having risk factors increase as ACE score goes up, but we looked at these problems one at a time. And the ACE researchers learned that ACEs can affect multiple brain systems and functions. So they wondered if higher ACE scores would lead to the risk of having multiple health and social problems. So on the right side of the screen, you'll see a list of 18 health and social problems that could be affected given the brain systems and functions known to be impacted by toxic stress. And then the researchers created a second score, and that's the average number of health and social problems of health in the health records of the study participants. So as we can see in this slide, the mean number of the 18 health problems listed on the right increases as the ACE score goes up. So if somebody had an ACE score of 0, they generally had about 1.5 of these health and social problems. But as these study participants had an ACE score of 7 or 8, they generally had 4.5 of these health and social problems. So both of the cost and the complexity is affected by adverse childhood experiences. And these are just some more examples of ACE attributable problems. They have powerful impact on many of our health and social problems. And ACE researchers concluded that ACEs are the leading cause of health and social problems in our nation. And that should really lead to us thinking about prevention. We have a really big opportunity right now to shift the trajectory of health and wellness, especially for the generations to come. So how do we knock down the ACE scores? So since the publication of the articles in the original ACE study, some states have started to gather information about ACEs in their own surveys of health, and they've been able to learn some things that the original study just couldn't give them. And the things they learned are pretty amazing. The higher ACE score, the more likely people have experienced adult homelessness, unemployment, poverty, disability, learning problems, and incarceration. Early trauma and stress lead to predictable patterns of development. And we don't really know what all these patterns are, but we do know that they're cognitive, they're attentional, and social outcomes that emerge. So children who do experience adversity, they may have a slow language development, and that can lead to special education, school failure, and ultimately dropping out. And children with attention problems, especially if they're undiagnosed and untreated, can not only experience academic failure, but they also are at risk for behavior problems, which can then result in suspension and expulsion, which then are correlated with delinquency, dropping out, and then entry into the juvenile justice system. And children who also experience social failure and behavioral problems that involve tantrums, aggression, and outbursts, that really just creates a fast track to trouble at school, suspension, and delinquency. In addition, these kids are at serious risk of developing chronic alcohol and drug use. So another thing with nicotine is that early onset use can, early smoking inhibits the prefrontal lobes of your brain, which creates the risk for impulsiveness and extreme behavior in late adolescence. And that combination is just a fast track to poor life outcomes. And the epidemiological evidence tells us it's also a fast track to poor adult mental and physical health. So achieving economic well-being truly is against the odds. But we do have to acknowledge that not every victim of adverse childhood experiences will have this life path. You know, numbers tell us that at least almost half population have ACEs, but a lot of us are contributing, we're successful, we're making a contribution. So we've seen how ACEs can affect health throughout the life course, from conception to early mortality. And we've also seen how people exposed to ACEs tend to develop the same behavioral and social problems that can become ACEs for the next generation. So now we're showing the arrow on the right side of the pyramid to emphasize the need to disrupt that intergenerational transmission. If anything to take away from today, it's that ACEs are common, they're highly interrelated, and they are really powerful. And they have a cumulative impact that is captured by the ACE score. And people with higher ACE scores are more likely to have multiple health and social problems, some of which increase the odds of their children then having high ACE scores. So this discovery about the effects of toxic stress in the developing brain does provide the biologic plausibility for the ACE study findings. And this information really makes a strong case concluding that the relationship between ACE score and health problems is truly a cause and effect relationship. So now how do we put this together? How do we use ACEs as a powerful pathway to health and well-being? So now that we understand how common ACEs are and how much they have an impact on the health of and social problems, preventing ACEs and their intergenerational transmission is one of the greatest opportunities we have. And it could really help create healthier communities. So this slide shows a percentage of various health and social problems that epidemiologists estimate are caused by ACEs, and that's called population attributable risk. And that's by the oil slide. So basically, the epidemiologists estimate that alcohol and binge drinking, 32.5% of that is attributed to ACEs, or tobacco use, 36.7% of tobacco use is attributed to ACEs. And the percentages are huge. Percentages this big are rarely seen in public health studies, so that's really something to focus on. And they're a powerful opportunity for prevention as well. So no matter what field you're working in, if we align a portion of our work together, we can really help reduce the amount of ACEs and moderating their effects across everyone's fields. And here's another chart. You can see painkillers to get high. So the epidemiologists estimate 54% of people who use painkillers to get high can be attributed to high ACE scores. IV drug use, 78% can be attributed to ACE scores. Alcoholism, 65%. So it's really quite astounding. So our culture has really built separate systems in ways of thinking about health and well-being, and we call it a siloed approach. Each silo has their own budget, training, and mental model about preventing and treating individual types of problems. And then that's their focus. So the ACE study and the knowledge about the effects of the brain structure show us that viewing the health and social problems as separate is really just not really helpful. And it's based on outdated mental models. And we know that there's many common health and social problems, and they have a common cause based on the powerful impact of ACEs. So it's not really practical to break down those silos, but we don't really have to all stop doing what we're passionate about. If we simply just add a common thread into all of our work, into all of our fields, we can really focus on diminishing the amount of ACEs, and we can really align all of our work in a really powerful way to do that. And the ACE study provides us with a straightforward information about the consequences of toxic stress. But it really isn't a detailed roadmap of services or programs, and it kind of invites us to do it our own way. So through the collective knowledge and action, we in our different fields have the power to kind of shift the dynamic within families and communities that lead to high ACE scores. And when people think about ACEs, they think about resilience, and we get excited about resilience because it reminds us that our supportive actions matter, and our desire for resilience leads naturally to search for ways to help families and communities. And there are 3 protective systems that interact and guide positive adaptation. And these systems are individual capabilities, attachment and belonging with caring and competent people, and protective community, culture and spirituality. So what do we know about individuals who do well despite adversity? We know that they have protective systems and they're nested. So people do best when they are living in thriving families and communities. And we can help one another develop personal attributes that help us weather life's storms. So personal attributes like positive view on one's life, self-efficacy, and self-regulation are discussed at length in the resilience literature. So the protective system, one of them is attachment and belonging. And most people talk about the importance of people in their lives, people who recognize and encourage our unique talents, interests, and strengths. But the relationships have to be caring and with competent people. That's vital to the contribution of resilience and recovery. Sometimes the competent part is left out, but competency requires learning new skills and practicing safety in all of its forms related to people who are hardwired for survival in dangerous situations and or an unpredictable world. So people who have difficulty with emotional regulation, picking up social cues, or problems with addiction and other consequences, they can be challenging friends and neighbors. But if we've decided to dramatically improve health and safety for future generations, we must foster thriving communities. And it's all about empowerment. It's about investing in the people who have the most at stake so they can be the expert leaders in their own communities, as well as investing in capacity. So it's not about sending leaders into the community, it's about building leaders in their own communities, building self-sufficiency, building community capacity. It's about helping people learn, helping them manage and improve their efforts systematically. And it's about the state of art of education and direct support and how to mobilize everyone who wants to help. And public and private partners that foster these thriving communities can really learn from those communities and celebrate really great results from their work. So to learn more about that, we just look at communities that have changed the way people work together to solve tough problems. And it doesn't happen overnight. It's a journey that intentionally builds new capacities and supports healing and prevention. So next, we're going to talk about Help That Helps. And that was just based on an analysis survey that was done in Washington State in 2010 that really goes along with ACEs. Big takeaway is ACEs are not destiny. We know tons of people affected by ACEs have become prominent leaders of self-healing communities and go on to do amazing and great things that help the next generation. And there are 4 resilience factors that really make the difference, and they're especially helpful when they're layered up. So the first one is feeling that social emotional support, having 2 or more people who can give concrete help when we need it, and then community reciprocity, so watching out for each other, and then finally social bridging, so reaching outside of their social circle. As you can see with smoking and support, there's a huge difference. With low support and hope, the percentage of people who smoke is much higher than people with high support and hope. So people with 4 to 8 ACEs with low support, about 35–36% smoked, and with high support, about 22% of those people smoke. That's a big difference. The next is help, which is really important, having at least 2 people or more who can really give us concrete help when we need it. And this is a crazy change, the depression and help. So the dark blue lines are the dark blue chart is people with low help and depression. And the one in the light blue is people that have more help. And that's a huge difference. For the 4 to 8 of ACEs, it goes from 12% of the population to 2% of the population. That's massive. Poor health and help. So this is moderate or mental illness. Again, same concept. The more help that we have, the lower mental illness that we have, despite the number of ACEs. That's the thing. So even if we do have ACEs, with help, we can be much healthier with those that adverse childhood experience. So community resilience, that's watching out for children, just being a good neighbor, helping each other, favors, and then social bridging, reaching outside your immediate social circle for somebody else. That can be really, really helpful in reducing the impact of ACEs. So there is a predictable pattern of the transformative changes, and it just kind of begins with communication. And that leads people to clarifying their values and thinking. And with this new knowledge and new habits and ways of thinking, we can really kind of change the actions we take in everyday life, professionally and personally. And the change is up to us. It's shaped by our thoughts and conversations, and we really can create a new reality long before laws and regulations are passed. So that's a little bit about ACEs. If we work to prevent the accumulation of ACEs, we don't have to get ACEs down to 0. That's not realistic, but being able to prevent any more, that's something that we can focus on. And if we all kind of work together in our own fields, that can really help prevent ACEs for the next generation.
Well, thank you for that. And I hope you guys have some questions to send us. But I can tell you that understanding ACEs transformed my way of looking at disease. And the fact that it takes a village to respond to this, you don't just need a good health plan or health insurance. You need to live in a healthy environment. So thank you for joining us. And I hope you found this presentation interesting.
Great. Well, thank you, ladies, so much for your presentation. I think the point about ACEs being cumulative and very powerful is so important, but I love the part where you also talked about, even though it's so cumulative and powerful, it's not your destiny.
Right.
It's really important. So thank you very much for that. So we are upon our 3 o'clock hour. So we're going to go ahead and move towards wrap up just to honor everyone's time. We want to thank Alyson and Dr. Mercatante so much for all the information. We've already have comments coming through how great the presentation was and how great the information was. So thank you for your time today. We appreciate it.